everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk about book hangovers. You know, those kind of books that you read and you just can't let go of after you finish them. The books that you loved so much that you want to stay in that world, and that love kind of reflects on to the next book that you decide to pick up. You just can't forget about the world and you want to go back to it, or the characters. Or it can also be about books that you really strongly disliked and that you just can't, you were so frustrated that you can't let go of them, and then you take that frustration with you over to the next book that you pick up just because you can't let go of it. As I was saying, I have recently been reading a couple of books that gave me a book hangover, that's what I'm trying to say. For that reason I was inspired to do this video, in which I have selected a few books, quite a lot actually, that I remember fondly because they gave me some kind of a hangover, and most of these are going to be some of my absolute favorite books that I have read over the past years, but there are also going to be a few books in between that I strongly disliked. But let's start on a positive note. The first series, because it is a series, that is The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. This is a fantasy series and I was enthralled in the series when I read it. I loved it to pieces. I was so engrossed in the world and the character of Quoth, who tells us his life story in this kind of bar. He has had a pretty fierce life, you could say. It's a fantastical world and he has experienced magic. He has gone to a university of magic, and it's just a really engrossing world building, and these characters, I love them as well. It also deals with some tragic events in his past, which I just remember fondly as well. So this series was so good, and once I was done with it, there is still a third one coming out, who knows when, but when I finished these two ones, I remember that I couldn't stop thinking about them. So these were some of the good ones that I have read and that I kind of want to read again, because they were so damn good. Even though they are pretty fierce, pretty huge, they're about 1,000 pages each. Next I have a book that I reread recently, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. The first time I read it, I remember that I loved it, but then for some reason, well, I was thinking about it afterwards and I did have kind of a hangover, but I think that the hangover was even more explicit the second time I read it recently. I remember reading in this book just before going to work, and then when I went to work I couldn't stop thinking about it and I wanted to get back to it. I knew what was coming because it was a reread, but I just had to have those words around me again. I had to dive into these characters, this story, and I specifically remember a scene in which we have a man who is living by himself in the very cold winter, and that scene, those chapters were just freezing. They made me freeze into my bones, if that makes sense. That was just one of my favorite scenes that I kept thinking about while I was reading it and also afterwards. So definitely a book that gave me a hangover. Very briefly, this is about 5 students of Greek, and their story all of a sudden takes a very macabre turn. Then we have In Order to Live by Youngbae Park, which is a non-fiction book about a woman who grew up in North Korea. She has now escaped the country, but it is about her growing up in that country. It is about the struggles of her family, what they went through. This is actual accounts of what was going on, and it was so devastating and eye-opening. It is one of those books that I kept thinking about it afterwards, so that I discussed it with my father, and we kind of talked about the conditions that the people in North Korea live under. I know that things are going on in North Korea right now, and also their relationship with South Korea, which is really encouraging to hear about. I hope that positive development will continue, but this book definitely educated me a lot on what is actually going on, and this is devastating and one of those books that I still think about today. Then we have a young adult book, which I read about, I think, 4 years ago now. So it's kind of vague in my memory, but I do remember that I loved it fondly, and it's one of those books that made an impact on me. I'm talking about Morgan Matson's Second Chance Summer, which is a book about Taylor, who has a tendency to run away from everything, every situation. But then one summer her father tells her that he is diagnosed with terminal cancer. So this will be their last summer together as a family. And it's just this devastating and very impactful story that is a young adult book. So it's heavy on the subject of cancer, but it's also very much about Taylor and her development and how she deals with this grief of hers. So I loved it to pieces, and I think it's one of those books that teared me up a little bit by the end. I also just couldn't forget it afterwards, which is why it's in this video, but definitely a beautiful and true story. But definitely a book that I do recommend and that I remember loving fondly. So let's do one of those books that gave me a hangover, but in a very negative way, because I was so frustrated for days and days, and I still am after having read this book. I am talking about Hunger by Roxane Gay, a memoir of my body. I did write a Goodreads review on Goodreads about my thoughts on this book. I gave it 1.5 stars, I think, because I didn't really care for it. I felt a lot like Roxane Gay writes about her relationship to food and her body, but while she's still in it, she's still in the midst of those frustrations and that anger that she projects towards everyone and everything else around her. So this was basically a rant on how frustrated and angry she is with everything and everyone. It could be doctors, it could be chairs, it could be people at the gym. She just really hated how everyone else lived and saw her. At least that's how she believed that they saw her. Well, the thing is, this is a memoir, and who am I to judge a person's personal experience? I'm not one to do that. But I bought this book because I thought that it would be about a journey in which she had arrived at some kind of a destination in the end and a resolution, and it didn't feel like that at all with this book. Basically, Roxane Gay did go through a very horrible experience when she was in her teens, and that experience traumatized her for life, so that she still today is not living a very healthy life. She is very overweight and she has a very unhealthy relationship to food. So it's a memoir about that experience and how it has impacted her. And I don't know, people said to me that I wasn't empathetic when they read my Goodreads review, which I do feel empathy towards her. I definitely do. I would be devastated myself if I had experienced a thing like this. But at the same time, Roxane is now an adult, and well, I'm not going to go into it. I just feel like this was just a rant and I didn't get much out of it. So I was frustrated, and I still am when I think about it now. So not a book that gave me one of the best hangovers. I have quite a lot of books yet to go, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. The next book is a book that, well, this is the book, Sputnik My Love by Haruki Murakami. It's not one of my favorite books, and it's not a book that impacted me so that I couldn't stop thinking about it, but it was one scene that I'm still thinking about today. It's one of my favorite literary scenes. It contains a Ferris wheel, and I just found it to be magical and enchanting, and that scene was so good, so brilliant, and it impacted me. So I would call that a book hangover, or at least a scene hangover. Then we have the Bronze Horseman trilogy by Paulina Simons. We have the Bronze Horseman, and I also have Tatiana and Alexander, as well as the Summer Garden. This series is set in Russia and in America, and I loved it to pieces. Let me just talk about the first one. This one is uniquely set in Russia, in Petrograd, during World War II. It's a love story about a very young girl who meets this soldier, and falls in love with him, but it's also about her family and the devastating conditions that they were living under in Russia during the war. And that was what gave me the hangover, the fact that they didn't have food to eat. They ate bread made of cardboard or something like that. People were dying around them and their living conditions were just deplorable. So that was the hangover from this book. The rest of the series gave me a hangover as well because of the beautiful love story. I will say that some people didn't like it because of some, I don't know, some problematic decisions that the characters make, which I do see, but I didn't find it problematic myself. So I have a lot of books in my hands right now, but basically this series is so impactful. It was, at least to me, that I am still very much in love with it and I highly recommend it. But do know and be warned that some people didn't like it at all. I don't understand that, but that's the case. Then we have 2 non-fiction books which I read recently and which are actually the reason why I was inspired to do this video. I'm talking about first, well, let's start with this one, The Diary of a Bookseller by Steinbeck. As you can see from the title, this is the diary of a bookseller, and it's a very sarcastic diary because being a bookseller is not everything it seems to be, apparently. And I loved it because of its tone of voice, but also because of its very accurate depictions of what it's like to be a bookseller. The persons he describes, the customers, everything just worked. So this book is one that I devoured it, and then I thought about it, and I'm still thinking about it today. The next one is Stephen King's On Writing, a memoir of the craft, and I'm not sure exactly what gave me the hangover. I think it's because of the middle part, which is about how to write a good book. According to Stephen King, he gave us some very usable advice, which I found interesting, and that's the advice that I am still thinking about today. Even though I'm not writing a book, I still sometimes notice his advice when I read a book, and I don't know, it was just interesting and it made an impact on me. And also it's a really good memoir on his childhood and just a very good book in general. John Steinbeck is one of my favorite authors, and I have here 2 books of his that have made such an impact on me that I would without a doubt tell you, if you ask me for my favorite books of all time, I would include these 2. I'm talking about East of Eden and The Grapes of Wrath. Both gave me huge hangovers. Let's start with a brief synopsis of this one. This is about a family who lives in Oklahoma and who lives in America during the Depression. So they are forced to leave their farm and their lives and go on a journey to the western part of America to find work there. And their journey is devastating, that's for sure. And then the other book, East of Eden, is about 2 brothers. They are twins. It's also about a town with the most incredible woman, a prostitute, who is so manipulative, who is one of the fiercest characters I've ever read about, one of the scariest characters I've read about. And it's also about the boy's father and some kind of an uncle, and everything about the dynamics between the characters just works. The brothers aren't introduced until the second half of the book, and this is also a retelling of the Bible, a part of the Bible. So many things about this book is amazing, and basically hangover with a big H. That's, here you have it. I wasn't sure to include this book, but I'm going to do it anyway because this video isn't long enough already. Irony. I'm talking about The Title Zone by Sarah Maas. I love this a lot. So this book is about parents, and it's about their daughter who all of a sudden one day stops breathing. She is revived, but the doctors can't figure out what happened to her, so they can't really help them continue living their lives, and now they are living in a constant worry that this is going to happen again. I'm not sure that the hangover from this book was very severe, as with some of the other books I've mentioned, but it was there, and it's one book that I do really want to reread very soon. It was a very hard read, but also very eye-opening, and I love those kinds of books. And it's one that I still think about now and then, so I guess that is a hangover. Another book that I read very recently is The Clay Girl by Heather Tucker. What an amazing piece of work. This book is written in very peculiar prose, so that you have to get into the writing style, and I did as well. I didn't really care for it in the beginning, but once I got into it, it worked so well and it made sense to me. This is about a girl who lives in a family that is broken. She has so many siblings and her parents aren't really able to take care of them, and then this girl has a seahorse as her best imaginary friend, and this seahorse kind of helps her deal with things and grow up under these circumstances. Such a beautiful, beautiful book. I love it to pieces, and it's a book that taught me about relationship between people and how you can still develop and grow and blossom even under the most dire circumstances. At least this girl did, and it taught me so much. It inspired me a lot. I have 2 books left. The next one is a new adult novel, and that is Maybe Someday by Colleen Hoover. This book was devastating and so beautiful. My mother read it as well. She loved it. It takes you by surprise. It has a twist in it that I didn't see coming, but behind that twist hides a very beautiful love story that is, I don't know, it's developed so well, I believe, and it contains music. This book has a soundtrack to it that you can listen to while reading, and it's just a beautiful novel that made me cry, it made me think, it made me smile, and it was just so impactful, and one book that I hold very dear to my heart and I still think about today. So it had to be on this list. Now, can you guess the last book that I'm going to talk about? I don't know if you can. Maybe you've noticed that it's missing here. I'm talking about A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This is a book about 4 college students living in New York, but as the story progresses, it zooms in on 2 of the men, and we realize that one of the men has had a very traumatic childhood that has broken him and has made him a very insecure human being today. And then this book is a gradual discovery of what actually happened to him, and let me tell you, it was devastating, and it's a book that taught me empathy. I don't know, when I finished it I had so many emotions, and it's one that I recommend to a lot of people because it seems to be on a lot of people's favorites list, and I know that not everyone agrees, but it was just a really eye-opening novel that I still think about, and very impactful. I almost can't talk about it right now still, because I just have so many feelings for this book, and it's definitely one that gave me a hangover, like the man on this picture. He looks like he has some kind of a hangover. And that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I also hope that you will give me some titles in the comments of books that gave you a hangover, and also very briefly what gave you the hangover, if you can explain that in some words. I would love to read about that. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and until my next video, happy reading.